Rebecca Sterling felt the air leave her lungs as if she'd been physically struck. 20 years of marriage, 20 years of flawless support and sacrifice, and this was her reward. Watching her husband Marcus stride confidently into the Sterling Industries annual dinner 40 minutes late with a young woman on his arm, the board members and family fell silent, their hushed whispers dying as Marcus cleared his throat, his hand possessively resting on the small of the woman's back. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Vanessa Chen," he announced, his voice carrying across the elegantly appointed dining room of the Sterling Grand Hotel. "She's carrying the next heir to Sterling Industries." The words hung in the air like shattered glass as all eyes turned to Rebecca, searching for the inevitable breakdown of the perfect corporate wife who had just been publicly humiliated in front of the entire company leadership and her mother-in-law, Eleanor Sterling. Before we dive deep into this heartfelt story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. Rebecca felt a curious calm descend over her, like ice crystallizing in her veins. Every instinct honed over 2 decades of navigating the treacherous waters of corporate politics took command. She placed her champagne flute gently on the table, rose to her feet with practiced grace, and crossed the room. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step measured and deliberate. The silence was deafening. "Vanessa," Rebecca said, extending her hand. Her voice was warm, genuine even. "How wonderful to meet you. Please, let me show you to your seat." Confusion flickered across Marcus's face, a brief, satisfying crack in his confident demeanor. He had expected tears, perhaps a scene. He had not expected this poised, gracious woman who now guided his mistress to the table as if welcoming an honored guest. Vanessa Chen, young, beautiful, and visibly pregnant, looked as stunned as everyone else. Her hand trembled slightly as it met Rebecca's, her eyes searching for the anger or resentment that should have been there. Finding none, she allowed herself to be led to the table. "Eleanor," Rebecca said, nodding to her mother-in-law, whose face had gone ashen. "I believe we should adjust the seating arrangement to accommodate our unexpected guest." Eleanor Sterling, a formidable woman in her 70s who had watched the Sterling Empire grow across 3 generations, gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Her eyes, sharp as cut diamonds, flicked between her son and her daughter-in-law, calculation evident in their depths. Throughout the dinner, Rebecca guided the conversation with the skill of a master conductor. Rather than allowing attention to linger on the scandal unfolding before them, she deftly steered topics toward business matters, occasionally drawing Vanessa into the discussion. "Vanessa, Marcus mentioned you have a background in international finance," Rebecca said, her voice carrying across the table during a lull in conversation. "What are your thoughts on our Asian market expansion?" Vanessa, initially hesitant, spoke with unexpected intelligence and insight. As she elaborated on market trends in Singapore and Hong Kong, Rebecca noticed several board members listening with growing interest, their initial disdain slowly morphing into reluctant respect. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the scenario unfolding nothing like he had anticipated. Under the table, his fingers tapped an agitated rhythm against his thigh. Rebecca caught the familiar gesture, a tell he'd always had when things slipped beyond his control. "Fascinating perspective," Rebecca commented when Vanessa finished speaking. "Isn't it, Marcus?" "Perhaps Vanessa could offer some insights on those Singapore investments you've been so interested in lately." Marcus's hand froze mid-tap, his eyes narrowing slightly as they met Rebecca's. For the first time that evening, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. How much did she know? The dessert course arrived, delicate chocolate structures that collapsed at the touch of a spoon, revealing molten centers. How appropriate, Rebecca thought, watching her husband of 20 years squirm subtly under her gaze. Things that appeared solid could still hold hidden, volatile contents. When the meal concluded, Marcus stood to make what he clearly intended to be the evening's defining address. His confidence had returned, bolstered by several glasses of the exclusive Cabernet reserved for special occasions. "I know tonight has brought some unexpected news," he began, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man accustomed to commanding attention. "But I believe in transparency with our board and our family. Changes are coming to Sterling Industries and to our family." His hand found Vanessa's shoulder. "I want to assure everyone that these transitions will be handled with the utmost consideration. Rebecca," he said, turning to his wife with what he clearly believed was magnanimous consideration, "will of course be provided for generously." Rebecca took a slow, deliberate sip of water, allowing the moment to stretch uncomfortably before speaking. When she placed her glass down, her wedding ring tapped gently against the crystal, the small sound somehow commanding complete attention. "Actually, Marcus," she said, her voice soft yet carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room, "I believe it's time we clarify exactly who will be providing for whom." She reached into the slim leather portfolio she always carried to board functions and withdrew a single document, placing it on the table before her. As some of you may recall, when Richard Sterling passed control of the company to Marcus 15 years ago, he established a rather unique trust structure. Her eyes found Eleanor's, seeing the older woman's slight nod of acknowledgement. 57% of Sterling Industries' voting shares were placed not in the hands of the CEO, but in the hands of the spouse of the CEO. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as understanding dawned on the faces around her. Marcus's expression hardened, disbelief battling with growing comprehension. "To put it simply," Rebecca continued, "while Marcus has been the face of Sterling Industries for 15 years, I have held controlling interest in the company all this time." She smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes for the first time that evening. "I've simply allowed him to operate as if the company were his." The silence that followed Rebecca's revelation was absolute, like the heavy stillness after a thunderclap. Marcus's face drained of color, his tan complexion fading to an ashen gray that made the sculpted angles of his face appear suddenly hollow. "That's not possible," he finally said, his voice lacking its usual command. "My father would never—" "Your father knew exactly what he was doing, Marcus," Eleanor interjected, her voice strong despite her years. Every head turned toward the Sterling matriarch. Richard was many things, but he was never a fool. Rebecca gave her mother-in-law a grateful glance before addressing the stunned board members. "I've brought copies of the relevant trust documents for each of you," she said, nodding to the hotel staff who now distributed sealed folders to everyone present. "You'll find everything is in perfect legal order." As papers rustled throughout the room, Rebecca watched the emotions play across Marcus's face: disbelief, rage, and finally, the calculating look she knew all too well. He was already searching for a loophole, an angle to exploit. For 20 years, she had watched him deploy this exact expression in boardrooms across the country, usually just before he outmaneuvered a competitor. "Even if this legal technicality exists," Marcus said, his voice regaining some of its strength, "Sterling Industries has flourished under my leadership. The board knows who built this company into what it is today." Several board members nodded, loyalty to Marcus evident in their expressions. Rebecca had anticipated this. 20 years as the silent partner had taught her to read not just balance sheets, but people. "Mr. Kavanaugh," she said, addressing the oldest board member, a man who had served since Richard Sterling's time, "would you please share why Richard structured the company this way?" Howard Kavanaugh cleared his throat, looking distinctly uncomfortable as he glanced between husband and wife. "Richard had concerns," he said carefully. "After Marcus's first marriage ended—" A muscle twitched in Marcus's jaw. His first marriage, brief, tumultuous, and carefully scrubbed from the company narrative, was rarely mentioned. Concerns about what exactly? Marcus demanded. Rebecca answered before Kavanaugh could speak. Your father witnessed certain behaviors that troubled him, Marcus. Patterns that apparently have repeated themselves. Her eyes flickered meaningfully toward Vanessa, who sat rigid in her chair, one hand protectively covering her slightly rounded belly. Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. Richard made Rebecca promise to protect the company if history repeated itself. She fixed her son with a stare that carried the weight of disappointed maternal love. A promise she's now fulfilling. Marcus laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. Protect the company? From me? I've tripled our market value in 15 years. And yet, Rebecca said, opening another folder, in the past 7 months, you've diverted $43 million to shell companies in Singapore. She slid financial statements across the table. Companies solely owned by you, outside the sterling corporate structure. The board members' murmurs grew louder as they examined the evidence before them. Marcus's face flushed dark with anger, his hands clenching into fists on the table. How did you... he began, then stopped himself, but not before Rebecca saw the flash of guilt in his eyes. How did I know? Rebecca finished for him. She allowed herself a small smile. You left breadcrumbs, Marcus. Small discrepancies in the quarterly reports. Nothing obvious, just numbers that didn't quite align when compared across departments. The same creative accounting that makes you so brilliant at tax strategy left patterns I could follow. The realization dawned on Marcus's face. He had underestimated her. For years he had seen her review company reports, believing it was merely a dutiful wife's interest in her husband's work. Never once had he imagined she was meticulously tracking every number, building a comprehensive understanding of the company's operations that rivaled his own. I can explain the Singapore investments, Marcus said, his voice taking on the smooth, persuasive tone he used to calm nervous investors. It's a complex tax strategy to protect company assets. It's embezzlement, Rebecca interrupted, her calm voice slicing through his explanation. And we both know it. Vanessa shifted in her seat, discomfort evident in her expression. Whatever Marcus had told her about his financial situation, this clearly wasn't part of it. Marcus changed tactics, turning toward Rebecca with practiced sincerity. Rebecca, whatever issues exist between us, we can resolve them privately. He reached across the table as if to take her hand, then thought better of it when he saw her expression. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous settlement. The house in Aspen. I know how much you love it there. Full ownership, plus an allowance that would make you quite comfortable. A flicker of something, not quite a smile, crossed Rebecca's face. The Aspen property that you purchased 4 months ago through Orion Holdings, one of your Singapore shell companies. She let the implication sink in. Purchased with embezzled company funds. Marcus paled again, his fingers unconsciously loosening his tie as if it had suddenly become too tight. Vanessa spoke for the first time since the revelations began. Marcus told me you knew about us, she said to Rebecca, her voice surprisingly steady. He said you gave your blessing months ago, that you had an arrangement. Rebecca met the younger woman's eyes, seeing not just confusion, but the dawning realization that she too had been manipulated. I'm afraid that's not true, Vanessa. Today is the first I've heard of your relationship, or your pregnancy. The two women held each other's gaze across the table, a silent understanding passing between them. They had both been deceived by the same man, albeit in different ways. I don't believe this, Marcus said, looking around the table for support. My own wife, conspiring to take over the company my family built, using private financial matters to embarrass me in front of the board? His voice rose with each word. What about your contributions, Rebecca? What exactly have you done for Sterling Industries besides attend charity galas and play hostess at dinner parties? The question hung in the air, a challenge that Rebecca had been waiting 20 years to answer. Rebecca felt the weight of every gaze in the room. For 20 years, she had stood in Marcus's shadow, content to let him take credit for their shared work. But now, as his question echoed in the elegant dining room, she realized the time for silence had passed. "My contributions?" she asked softly. "Let's discuss them, shall we?" She turned to face the board members directly. The Sterling loyalty program that increased repeat bookings by 37%. Whose idea was that? Walter Chen, the head of marketing, blinked in surprise. "That was your concept?" Marcus presented it in the strategy meeting last year. "It was. I developed the framework after analyzing 3 years of customer data." Rebecca looked at Marcus, whose jaw had tightened. "I gave him the complete presentation, which he delivered verbatim to the board." She turned to the CFO. "Janet, remember when we refinanced the expansion loan in 2019? Who suggested the structured payment approach that saved us $4 million in interest?" Janet Fraser nodded slowly. "Marcus did, but—" Her eyes widened slightly. "You were the one who sent me the initial calculations, weren't you? You said Marcus asked you to forward them." "He didn't," Rebecca said simply. "That was my financial analysis." One by one, Rebecca identified projects, initiatives, and strategic decisions that had shaped Sterling Industries over the past decade. With each example, board members exchanged glances as the pattern became clear. Behind Marcus's successes had always been Rebecca's intelligence and insight. "The Sterling Grand Renovation Timeline," she continued. "Everyone thought it was impossible to complete it in 9 months without disrupting operations. Who created the phased construction schedule that made it possible?" "You did," Eleanor said quietly. "I remember Richard commenting on how brilliant it was, how you'd found a solution none of our contractors had considered." Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous. Taking credit for company decisions after the fact is hardly—" "Check the email records," Rebecca interrupted. "Check the meeting notes. Check the file metadata on every proposal. You'll find my fingerprints all over this company's success, Marcus. I never needed credit before, but I won't let you erase my contributions now." The board members looked between husband and wife, decades of assumptions crumbling before their eyes. The story they'd accepted, of the brilliant businessman and his decorative spouse, was being rewritten before them. Howard Kavanaugh, who had served on the board since Richard Sterling's time, cleared his throat. "Marcus has been the face of this company for 15 years, he said, his loyalty to the Sterling heir evident in his tone. "Whatever behind-the-scenes suggestions Rebecca may have made, he has steered this ship through good times and bad. The Sterling name means something in this industry because of his leadership." Rebecca felt a moment of doubt creep into her certainty. Would her evidence be enough against decades of established relationships? Would the board stand with her, or with the man whose name matched the one on the building? Marcus, sensing the hesitation, pressed his advantage. "Howard's right. This company exists because of my family's vision and my execution of that vision. Rebecca may have had some good ideas along the way, and I've always valued her input, but suggesting she's been some kind of shadow CEO is simply absurd." Rebecca took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of this pivotal moment. She had one more card to play. "2 months ago," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "Marcus began contacting our top clients privately, suggesting he might be launching a new venture." She removed another document from her portfolio. "Here are records of 17 separate meetings with Sterling clients, none of which appeared on his official calendar." Marcus's expression flickered with surprise. He hadn't expected her to know about those meetings. "He's been laying groundwork to take our clients with him," Rebecca continued, while simultaneously draining company resources through his Singapore accounts. The revelation shifted the atmosphere in the room. Even Howard Kavanaugh looked troubled by this news. Client relationships were the lifeblood of their business. Attempting to poach them was an unforgivable breach. "That's speculation," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Rebecca turned to Vanessa, whose expression had grown increasingly troubled throughout the evening. Vanessa, when did Marcus first discuss leaving Sterling Industries to start his own company? The younger woman looked between Rebecca and Marcus, conflict evident in her eyes. Finally, she straightened her shoulders and spoke. 3 months ago. He said we'd use his family connections to start fresh, with a more modern approach. She hesitated. He said the board was too old-fashioned, too tied to his father's outdated vision. Several board members bristled visibly at this characterization. Marcus shot Vanessa a look of betrayal, which she met with unwavering resolve. Whatever loyalty she might have felt toward him was clearly being re-evaluated in light of the evening's revelations. Eleanor Sterling, who had been quietly observing the unfolding drama, finally spoke. "I've heard enough." Her voice, though soft, commanded immediate attention. "Rebecca, what are your intentions for Sterling Industries? Should the board confirm your controlling interest?" The question silenced everyone. All eyes turned to Rebecca, who suddenly realized she stood at a crossroads. This moment would define not just her future, but the legacy of the company that had consumed 20 years of her life. She had prepared for this confrontation, but now faced with the reality of it, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. "My intention," she said slowly, "is to preserve what Richard Sterling built, to honor his vision of a company that values integrity as much as profit." She looked directly at Marcus. "To prevent the Sterling name from being tarnished by scandal and self-interest." Marcus laughed bitterly. "Always the perfect corporate wife, aren't you, Rebecca? So concerned with appearances and legacy." His voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "But you've forgotten one thing. I'm still the public face of this company. How do you think our clients will react when they learn about this boardroom coup, when they see the Sterling family tearing itself apart?" His threat hung in the air, a final attempt to regain control of a situation rapidly slipping through his fingers. Rebecca felt a cold clarity wash over her. This was the Marcus she had always known existed beneath the charming facade, the man who would threaten to burn down everything rather than relinquish control. "Is that your plan?" she asked quietly. "To damage the company out of spite if you can't control it?" "I'm simply stating facts," Marcus replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Perception is reality in this business. If our clients sense instability, they'll look elsewhere." Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "Enough." The single word, spoken with authority that came from decades at the center of the Sterling Empire, silenced the room. "This display is precisely why Richard structured the company as he did." She turned to her son, disappointment evident in every line of her face. "You've always valued your own interests above all else, Marcus." "Mother, surely you can't support this betrayal." Marcus gestured toward Rebecca, genuine disbelief in his expression. "The only betrayal I see," Eleanor replied evenly, "is a man who brought his pregnant mistress to a family dinner to humiliate his wife of 20 years. She turned to Rebecca. "You have my support, whatever you decide." Rebecca nodded her thanks to Eleanor before addressing the board. "I understand this is unexpected. I'm not asking for immediate decisions tonight. Review the documents. Verify everything I've said. We'll reconvene tomorrow morning to discuss next steps." Howard Kavanaugh studied Rebecca with new respect. "A reasonable approach," he acknowledged, "though I must admit, I find it difficult to reconcile the Rebecca Sterling who has sat quietly at company functions for years with the woman standing before us now." "I've always been this woman, Howard," Rebecca said with a small smile. "I simply allowed Marcus to be the voice for both of us." She gathered her documents, signaling an end to the evening. "Until tomorrow, then." As board members filed out, murmuring among themselves, Marcus approached Rebecca. He waited until they were relatively alone, though Vanessa and Eleanor remained in the room, watching cautiously from a distance. "I underestimated you," he said, his voice low. "A mistake I won't make again." Rebecca met his gaze steadily. "No, you won't have the opportunity." She turned to leave, then paused. "I would like to meet with you privately tomorrow, before the board meeting. My office, 8 a.m. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Your office?" "Yes," Rebecca replied simply. "The one I've maintained in the East Wing for the past 5 years. I'm sure your assistant can direct you." The revelation that she had maintained a separate office space, one he hadn't even known existed, seemed to unsettle Marcus more than anything else that had occurred that evening. It represented the extent to which she had built a life parallel to the one he thought she lived. As Rebecca gathered her belongings, Vanessa approached her hesitantly. "I didn't know," she said quietly, "about any of this. About you." Rebecca studied the younger woman, seeing not just the obvious beauty that had attracted Marcus, but intelligence in her eyes and a certain strength in her bearing. "I believe you," she said after a moment. "Marcus has always excelled at telling people exactly what they need to hear to get what he wants." Vanessa's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach. "What happens now? To me? To the baby?" Rebecca's expression softened. "That's not for me to decide, Vanessa. Your relationship with Marcus is between the two of you. The child you're carrying is innocent in all this." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But I can promise you this. As long as I have any influence at Sterling Industries, your child will never want for anything." Tears filled Vanessa's eyes, the first genuine emotion she had displayed all evening. "Thank you," she whispered. Rebecca nodded once before turning to leave. As she walked through the hotel's grand lobby, she felt simultaneously exhausted and electrified. For 20 years, she had played a role: the supportive wife, the silent partner. Tonight, that role had been shattered, and she found herself standing in the rubble of her former life, uncertain of what shape the future would take. The night air was cool against her skin as she stepped outside. Her driver moved to open the car door, but Rebecca waved him off. "I'll walk for a bit, James. Meet me at the corner of Maple and Fifth in 20 minutes. "Yes, Mrs. Sterling," he replied, concern evident in his voice. Rebecca smiled at his worry. "I'm fine, James. Better than I've been in a long time, actually." As she walked through the quiet streets, her heels clicking rhythmically on the pavement, Rebecca allowed herself to feel the full weight of the evening's events. The public humiliation, the revelations, the confrontation 20 years in the making. She had known this day would come eventually. Marcus's behavior had been growing increasingly reckless over the past year. The embezzlement, the secret meetings, and now Vanessa. It was as if he believed himself untouchable, above the consequences that governed ordinary men. Rebecca's phone buzzed with an incoming text. Eleanor Sterling's name flashed on the screen. "You did well tonight. Richard would be proud. Call if you need anything." The simple message brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. Richard Sterling had seen something in her that his own son had missed, a strength of character and clarity of purpose that matched his own. In his final years, as cancer slowly claimed him, he had spent hours discussing the company with Rebecca, extracting her promise to protect his legacy if Marcus ever threatened it. "I hope I'm wrong about him," Richard had said, his once powerful frame diminished by illness. "I hope he proves himself to be better than I fear." "And if he doesn't?" Rebecca had asked. Richard's eyes, sharp despite his failing body, had held hers. "Then you'll know what to do." Now, walking through the quiet city streets, Rebecca whispered to the night air, "I know what to do, Richard. I know what to do." The morning sun streamed through the windows of Rebecca's office, casting long rectangles of light across the polished surface of her desk. Unlike Marcus's ostentatious corner office with its imposing views and intimidating furniture, Rebecca's space was designed for efficiency and comfort. The walls held degrees and professional certifications, evidence of qualifications she rarely mentioned in social settings. She checked her watch. 7:55. Marcus would arrive soon, assuming he decided to come at all. After last night's confrontation, she half expected him to skip this meeting and proceed directly to the board, where he would attempt to rally support through sheer force of personality. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. To her surprise, Marcus stood in the doorway, 5 minutes early. He looked impeccable as always. Tailored suit, perfect Windsor knot in his silk tie, but the shadows under his eyes betrayed a sleepless night. "Please, come in," Rebecca said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Marcus entered, his gaze sweeping across the office, taking in the photographs of hotel openings, the industry awards discreetly displayed on a side shelf, the neat stacks of financial reports. Evidence of a professional life lived parallel to the one he had observed. "How long have you had this office?" he asked, remaining standing despite her invitation to sit. "Since the East Wing renovation. 5 years, 2 months. Rebecca remained seated, refusing to cede the psychological advantage of height. "You signed the authorization for the space allocation. I doubt you read it." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "I've been busy running a multinational corporation." "We both have," Rebecca corrected gently. "The difference is, only one of us has acknowledged it." Marcus finally sat, the motion stiff with reluctance. "What's this meeting about, Rebecca? Haven't you humiliated me enough?" Rebecca studied the man she had married 20 years ago. He was still handsome, still carried himself with the confidence born of privilege and success. But now she saw him clearly, without the veil of loyalty that had colored her perception for so long. "This meeting is about giving you options," she said, her voice calm and measured. "Because despite everything, we built something valuable together, and I don't want to see it destroyed." "Options?" Marcus laughed without humor. "What options could you possibly offer me now that you've laid claim to my company?" "Our company," Rebecca corrected. "And yes, options." She opened a folder on her desk. Option 1. We make this public. Every detail. The embezzlement. The attempted client poaching. The pregnant mistress. Your career won't survive it. Not just at Sterling, but anywhere in the industry. Marcus's face darkened with anger. "You wouldn't dare." "I already have the press release drafted," Rebecca said, sliding a document across the desk. "I'd prefer not to use it." Marcus glanced at the paper but didn't touch it. "And option 2? "A controlled transition," Rebecca said. "You step down as CEO, citing personal reasons. We handle the financial irregularities internally. You retain a position on the board, though without voting power. Your reputation remains largely intact." "And what happens to Vanessa?" "To my child?" Marcus asked, surprising Rebecca with what appeared to be genuine concern. "That's between you and Vanessa," Rebecca replied, "though I've already assured her that Sterling Industries will support her child financially, regardless of your personal arrangements." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying Rebecca as if seeing her for the first time. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "I've had 20 years to prepare," she said simply. "Was it all a lie?" Marcus asked suddenly. "Our marriage? Were you just waiting for this moment all along?" The question caught Rebecca off guard. She had expected anger, bargaining, even threats, but not this glimpse of vulnerability. "No," she answered honestly. "I loved you, Marcus. Deeply. I believed we were partners in every sense." She paused, memories of happier times briefly clouding her vision. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as an equal. I became part of the decor, the perfect corporate wife who made you look good at functions and never challenged your authority." "That's not fair," Marcus protested, but the objection lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Rebecca asked. When was the last time you asked my opinion on anything that mattered? When was the last time you shared a business concern with me, or celebrated a success as something we achieved together? Marcus had no answer. I didn't want this confrontation, Rebecca continued. I would have been content to continue our arrangement. You as the public face, me working behind the scenes. But you forced my hand when you started embezzling company funds. And then you brought Vanessa to our family dinner. A hint of the pain she had suppressed broke through her composed exterior. Why, Marcus? Why humiliate me that way? For the first time, Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable. I thought... He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. I convinced myself you already knew, that you had chosen to look the other way as long as I was discreet. And last night? There was nothing discreet about that. Marcus looked away. Vanessa has been pushing for public acknowledgement. She didn't want to be hidden away like some shameful secret. He met Rebecca's gaze again. And part of me wanted to force a resolution. Our marriage has been a polite fiction for years, Rebecca. We both know that. The truth of his words stung, but Rebecca couldn't deny them. They had drifted apart long before Vanessa entered the picture, becoming more business partners than husband and wife, sharing a home, but rarely their thoughts or feelings. So, what now? Marcus asked. Do we continue this mutually assured destruction, or find a way forward? Rebecca pushed a document across the desk, a different one than the press release. This outlines the terms of Option 2. Review it with your lawyers if you wish. The board meets at 10. Marcus took the document, his fingers brushing against hers in the process. The familiar touch sent an unexpected jolt through Rebecca, a reminder of all they had once been to each other. I never saw you, Marcus said quietly, almost to himself. Not really. That was my greatest mistake. Rebecca watched Marcus leave, the document clutched in his hand. A strange emptiness filled her chest. Not quite sadness, not quite relief, but something in between. 20 years of marriage was ending, not with the dramatic screaming match she might have once imagined, but with a business negotiation. Perhaps that was fitting, given how their relationship had evolved. The board meeting at 10 o'clock was tense but decisive. Marcus arrived last, sliding into his usual seat at the head of the table before realizing the subtle shift that had occurred overnight. Rebecca now occupied that position, with Eleanor Sterling seated at her right hand, a visual representation of the power transfer that had taken place. I've reviewed the documents Rebecca provided, Howard Kavanaugh announced, speaking for the board. They are, unfortunately, exactly as she described. The trust structure is legally binding. The financial irregularities are well documented. He looked at Marcus with genuine regret. The board has no choice but to recognize Rebecca Sterling as the controlling shareholder of Sterling Industries. Marcus nodded once, his expression carefully neutral. I understand. And I've come to an agreement with my wife regarding next steps. He turned to Rebecca, yielding the floor with a gesture that seemed to physically pain him. Marcus will be stepping down as CEO, effective immediately, Rebecca announced. He will retain an advisory position on the board, allowing us to benefit from his experience while we transition to new leadership. Several board members looked relieved at this measured approach, far preferable to the public scandal they had feared might erupt. And who will lead Sterling Industries now? Janet Fraser asked, though the answer seemed obvious to everyone in the room. I will assume the role of interim CEO while we evaluate long-term leadership options, Rebecca replied. Additionally, I'm establishing the Sterling Legacy Trust to ensure ethical governance moving forward, with Eleanor Sterling serving as the trust's principal advisor. Eleanor nodded approvingly, the ghost of a smile playing at her lips. As the meeting continued, Rebecca outlined her immediate priorities: a full financial audit, renewed focus on their core hospitality business and a commitment to transparency with staff and stakeholders. Marcus remained silent throughout, his eyes rarely leaving Rebecca's face. When the meeting concluded, he was the first to leave, striding from the boardroom without a backward glance. 3 months later, Rebecca stood at the window of the Sterling Grand's presidential suite, watching the city lights emerge as dusk fell. The same view she had contemplated countless times before, though now she saw it through different eyes, not as the CEO's wife, but as the CEO herself. A knock at the door announced the arrival of her guests. Eleanor entered first, elegant as always in a tailored navy suit that emphasized her still impressive posture. Vanessa followed, her pregnancy now prominently visible beneath a flowing maternity dress. "Rebecca, darling," Eleanor said, embracing her daughter-in-law, "the place looks wonderful. The new lobby design is exactly what this old building needed." "Thank you," Rebecca replied, returning the embrace before turning to Vanessa. "I'm glad you could make it. How are you feeling?" "Enormous," Vanessa said with a tentative smile, "but good. The doctor says everything is progressing perfectly." The 3 women settled into the sitting area, where a light dinner had been arranged. Their monthly meetings had become a surprising constant in Rebecca's new life, initially awkward, but gradually evolving into something resembling friendship. "Have you decided on a name yet?" Eleanor asked Vanessa as she served herself from the artfully arranged platters. "Lily," Vanessa replied. "Lily Chen, my grandmother's name." Rebecca noticed the absence of the Sterling surname, but said nothing. Marcus's relationship with Vanessa had shifted dramatically in the aftermath of the boardroom confrontation. He had established a trust fund for the child, made arrangements to be involved in her life, but the romantic relationship had dissolved under the weight of revealed truths. "A beautiful name," Eleanor approved. "And how is Hong Kong treating you?" Vanessa had accepted a position with Sterling's Asian division, leveraging her genuine financial talents rather than her connection to the Sterling family. "Challenging, but in the best way," she replied. "The market expansion project is moving faster than we anticipated." Their conversation flowed easily, touching on business, the pregnancy, and the changes at Sterling Industries over the past 3 months. Rebecca found herself relaxing in a way she rarely had during her years as Marcus's wife, when every social interaction was carefully calculated for its business impact. As the evening concluded and her guests prepared to leave, a hotel staff member approached discreetly. "Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Sterling is in the lobby. He's asking if he might speak with you briefly." Rebecca exchanged glances with Eleanor and Vanessa. "Of course," she said after a moment. "Show him up." Marcus entered the suite minutes later, looking both familiar and somehow changed. The superficial details were the same, the expensive suit, the confident stance, but something in his eyes was different, humbler perhaps, more genuine. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, nodding to his mother and Vanessa. "I can come back another time." "No need," Eleanor replied, gathering her purse. "We were just leaving. Come, Vanessa, I'll walk you to your car." When they were alone, Marcus looked around the suite, his gaze finally settling on Rebecca. "The hotel looks good. The new direction seems to be working." "It is," Rebecca agreed. "Bookings are up 12% since the renovation." A moment of awkward silence stretched between them. "I wanted to tell you," Marcus finally said. "I've been seeing someone. A therapist." He smiled self-deprecatingly at Rebecca's surprised expression. "I know, the last thing anyone expected, but I needed to understand how I became the person who could do what I did. To the company. To you." Rebecca studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation she had grown so adept at recognizing. Finding none, she nodded. "I'm glad, Marcus. Truly." "I also wanted to say—" He hesitated, then continued with visible effort. "Thank you. What you built at Sterling, what we built, though I took too much credit, it deserved better than what I almost did to it. As Marcus left, Rebecca turned back to the window, watching the city lights glitter below like stars in a newly discovered constellation. What had begun as personal betrayal had transformed into unexpected freedom. The sterling name still gleamed on the building's facade, but now it reflected a different truth, one forged in fire, tempered by courage. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart beneath her fingertips. The woman, looking back at her in the reflection, was no longer a shadow behind a powerful man, but the architect of her own destiny. Like the hotel that bore her name, Rebecca Sterling stood tall against the skyline, renovated, renewed, and finally, completely her own. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.